Welcome back to another episode of Right Here in Mass. Joining me today is Andy Kamholz, who has 20 years of experience as an executive, leading growth stage companies to market success. He currently serves as CEO of Edge Precision Manufacturing Incorporated, which he founded in 2005. Edge is a CMO for high precision thermoplastic disposables and has helped dozens of companies bring products to market. He led Edge through a 2015 merger, 2018 spinout, and finally through a 2022 acquisition by ZEON Corporation. Andy, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashley. Thanks for having me here.
It's my pleasure. I'm very excited to have you because your industry seems quite niche. And so we haven't had anyone in this space yet. And I always love bringing in new voices and people from all different spaces. And so I think this is going to be a good episode. But Andy has a very impressive bio that our listeners can find in the show notes. But Andy, I'd love to start off by giving you the opportunity to share more about yourself and what you do.
Sure, you gave a nice intro there. I started off as a biomedical engineer and went to both undergrad and graduate school for that. When I was in graduate school, I got introduced to this field called microfluidics, which was sort of brand new at that time, and is now quite mature. And it ends up being useful in some ways and not useful in ways that many of us imagined it would be 30 years ago. But it's quite prevalent these days in clinical diagnostics, all kinds of medical devices, even in some optical devices. And I specialized in it in grad school and then eventually went to work for a couple of companies who were using the technology, and then finally founded Edge, which became a prototyper and a manufacturer of that technology. And just to give you an idea, probably about a third of our customers over the years have been Boston area. So Boston biotechs, people who are developing diagnostic tools, research tools, point of care diagnostics, all sorts of things like that. And basically, we make their precision plastic disposables. So these are devices that might handle a drop of blood, that might collect, for example, a nasal swab and then put that nasal swab in solution and look for certain antibodies or antigens that are in there, also known as a COVID test, all sorts of things like that. So all of these things require precision plastic disposables, and that's what we're in the business of making.
And so I'm curious to hear, since you had started the company back in 2005, what inspired you or led you to become an entrepreneur and kind of go from working for other companies to now starting your own thing?
Yeah, it's such a funny story because around 2003, so a couple of years before I started Edge, actually it's probably even back as far as 2002, 2001. I was working for a biotech startup that was actually working in the defense against chemical and biological warfare agents. And in the wake of 9/11 and the anthrax in the mail, that was a pretty big deal back in that time frame. And the CEO said to me, "Oh, Andy, I think you're an entrepreneur. You're going to start your own company one day." And I was offended because to me, the idea of being an entrepreneur was like, "Oh, your head's in the clouds. You're dreaming. You're spending lots of money without actually ever doing anything useful." And of course, that's not how he meant it. And it took me a lot of years to understand what I actually think entrepreneur means. But in the end, he was right. Because a couple of years later, I found myself working for a Boston area company that was divesting that branch of the business. So they announced that they were going to be shutting down. And I looked at my wife and I said, "Gosh, I think I could use a lot of the hardware they have here to sort of provide prototyping services for other companies that need plastic disposables. What do you think?" And at that time, my wife and I were, I think were technically not even married yet at that moment, because actually we got married and I founded the company in the same year.
Busy
But we knew
year.
we were going to get, yeah, we were engaged already, so we knew we were going to get married if we weren't already. And she said, "Listen, double income, no kids, like small mortgage, now's as good a time to go for it as ever, so go for it." And so she gave me a lot of support and a lot of great business ideas as well. And we just went ahead and started. And then it was a matter of finding how can we provide value to these companies and how can we make money doing that, which was not easy. Lots of ups and downs and lots of hills and valleys over the whole 20 years it's been since then.
Hmm.
But lots of good stuff.
Yeah. And so since we're at that 20-year mark, I'm curious to hear how things have changed throughout that time or anything, any new developments that have come out of it. I mean, I think it's remarkable that it's been 20 years. And so I'm curious to hear kind of how things have, I guess, grown and whatnot throughout the years.
Yeah, of course. I mean, so for the first bunch of years, it was just me. And I had help now and then from a student. We actually started up on Boston Avenue in Medford slash Somerville, which is just
Hmm.
up the street from Tufts. Actually, Tufts is on Boston Avenue down at the other end. So we had some Tufts students who would come in and help us out. And it was very much an incubator type company. And I was just out there trying to find people we could work with and, getting small projects here and there. And over time, we found that to grow, we needed to have more capabilities. We couldn't just be prototyping. We couldn't just be making the base plastic part. We had to do things like assembly of multiple components together and packaging and other services like that, helping customers with their designs, things along those lines. And as we added those capabilities and we sort of increased the size of projects, we were able to add more people. But that was sort of the story for the first 10 years. After that, we took on our first investment in 2018.
Hmm.
Again, when we were spun out of an organization that we had joined, and that was far into our company's existence, but that was because a venture capital company, Anzu Partners, came in and said, "Hey, we think this could be something special, but you have to improve your technology. You have to hire some specialists." And so they gave us the capital to sort of jumpstart that, to reinvent our molding technology basically from the ground up, to
Hmm.
bring in a couple of really smart people who are still with us today, and really help us, think ahead. And then eventually, when we became part of Xeon, now suddenly we're part of a multi-billion-dollar company and an international company that has a much longer view and a much, an amazing track record
Yeah.
and access to all kinds of resources. And they also, of course, have a bottom line, right? So it's a very different sort of situation. So there's been, I would say, a lot of sort of births and rebirths as we've gone on, and has to have been a lot of adjustment to the changes in the market as well. Also, there's been a pile of mistakes so large I can't even see the top of it anymore.
Which I think is something that's a great reminder that you just share with our listeners that as you continue to build and grow a business, that there are going to be mistakes, but mistakes are where you learn. And I imagine that, like you said, through the rebirths that you've gone through multiple times within the company, I'm sure that the setbacks have brought you further ahead because of what you've learned and how you could improve the next time around.
I would think so, although I would say the art of learning from your mistakes is a difficult one and probably the most important one that there is. There's a mistake that I've made over and over again at my company, which took me a long time to even recognize was actually the same mistake that was being repeated. And that was not fully understanding what value the services that we offered were bringing to our clients. And that was sometimes overestimating that value and sometimes underestimating that value. So, anybody who's worked at a small company, not necessarily any small company, but many small companies, many startups, there tends to be a thing where a bunch of engineers get in a room and they say, "Hey, if we build this amazing thing, people will want it." And they're not actually experts in the application. And it turns out nobody wants it because the
Mhm.
people who actually use the instruments or devices have a totally different way of thinking. You can't you can't engineer your way into a great product. You just can't. No matter how smart you think you are, you have to be an area expert. And you have to be asking all the right questions to evaluate what is this really worth?
Hmm.
A lot of times the customer doesn't even know how to answer that question. They don't actually know what it's worth to them. So it's a really difficult trap, and it's one that requires a lot of scrutiny and a lot of doing over and over again and starting over and over again and asking yourself the hard questions.
Yes, absolutely. And one of those things that did happen was, like you mentioned in 2018, the spin out. And so I know you briefly kind of shared what it was, but for our listeners who are unfamiliar with what a spin out is, would you be able to explain that and then talk about what it is exactly that happened and kind of what led to that point, if that makes sense?
Sure. Spin out in general just refers to when a piece of an existing company is identified as something that can stand on its own, and then there's an effort made to basically have it stand on its own.
Hmm.
And it happens for a number of different reasons, but usually it's because there's a divergence between the main company's goals or the way they operate and what this entity within that company might want to do. And somebody looks at it and says, we're not going to do this. We're not going to do these two things together because they're way too different. But they both ideas are good, and so let's separate them and see if we can grow them separately. A good example might be, let's say you work in a sandwich shop and the sandwich shop, bakes their own bread and makes sandwiches and all that. And let's say, Ashley, you're an expert in oven design and maintenance, and you tinker with that oven and you make an amazing oven that makes amazing bread and has huge advantages over all other ovens. Well, the owners of that business, maybe it's you or maybe it's investors you have or whatever, might look at it and say, hey, there's a separate business idea here, but we're not going to sell sandwiches and ovens, right?
Mm,
That doesn't make
yeah.
sense, right? Nobody walks in the door and says, I'm going to take 3 sandwiches and 5 ovens, right? That's not how it works. And so they might say, hey, Ashley has developed a really valuable piece of intellectual property around ovens, and we own it because she works for the company. And again, maybe you're the owner of it in this fake scenario. But the wisdom is there to say, let's break this out and let's pursue it, but pursue it separately. So that's why you do a spin out.
Hmm.
And so in our case, I mean, and any small business owner will understand this from the very beginning. The One of the big struggles in our first 10 years was we got a lot of projects. We're working hard on the projects. We're getting stuff kicked out to customers. But man, is it hard to collect checks and deposit checks and pay people. So whether it was me or whether it was people who were working for me for an hourly wage or whatever, the collecting of those checks and the cash flow was a burden in and of itself.
Hmm.
Things like, chasing the FedEx truck down the street to make sure your shipment gets out so that it gets there one day sooner so you can issue an invoice sooner so that 30 days later when the money is due comes one day sooner,
Hmm.
right? Because you need to get that check deposited so that you can write a check to the person who's expecting to get paid. That's crazy, but it's something that all small business owners have to deal with. I eventually got tired of that, and a friend of mine, actually the same friend who told me I was going to be an entrepreneur, by this time, more than a decade later, he sold that company. He moved on to another company that he co-founded. He said, hey, why don't you join up with us and we'll manage your cash flow for you. And as long as you're making enough money to ultimately pay your bills, you don't have to worry about, is there enough cash in the bank on this date to write a check? And that was great. And we did that for a few years where every check that we got, every dollar that came into the business, I eventually just forwarded to their CFO. But they paid all of our bills for us. And so it was just fantastic. What happened was that company, which is called ZEON Tech, and they're still around and doing very well today, they got an investment from this same company that I mentioned, Anzu Partners, which is a venture capital firm. I think they might build themselves as sort of a hybrid venture capital private equity firm. And they looked and they said, "What is this thing, Edge? What is this little, And they said, "Oh, don't worry about it. It's just another company that, we're just helping out. And they're doing some stuff that's related to what we're doing, but they're sort of independently operating." And they poked at it a little bit more. And one of the principals there had a real interest in this area. And he said, wow, couldn't this be a thing?
Mhm.
And long story short, not that long, 6 months later, maybe, a deal was struck where Anzu, acquired a controlling interest in Edge from ZEON and spun it back out. So it was as if a brand new company was created because I was made CEO of the new company. I was given some founder stock, a employee stock option plan was created so that employees could get access to stock options, and it basically ran as a startup from that point forward.
Yeah, and that's so interesting to think about. And especially like you mentioned too, it led to that 2022 acquisition a few years later. And so I'm curious to hear what it was like to transition from being that founder to now being the CEO. Like, is there a noticeable difference, or would you say it's closely aligned? Maybe there's some similarities, maybe there's some differences, but I'm just curious overall to hear what that was like just with your change of title ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, technically, I was always CEO because when we were a one-person LLC, I was CEO. I
Mhm.
was also janitor and, every other title. But but technically I was CEO. And so my title sort of doesn't feel like it's changed, but of course the structure around me has changed
Mm,
because first it went from being a one-person company, and then it was a one-person company that had a few students and a couple of his buddies helping out. And then it went to like where we actually hired people who I didn't know before, and we interviewed and recruited and, hired some young engineers. And then it went to a point where we had investors and we hired more people. So now it's like suddenly a real company and we have to actually have like HR and offer medical insurance and other benefits. And from there, with the acquisition by ZEON, now we're part of a big company that is a public company in Japan. So there's just, a ton of rules that we need to follow and make sure that we honor all the commitments that the parent company has and not do anything to get them in trouble, which means we basically follow all the rules that a big corporation would follow. So that has all sort of changed around me. And I will say that one thing I have been very aware of is, you walk in a room and you say, "Hey, I'm a CEO with 20 years of experience," or whatever. It can mean very different things.
mhm.
I I am not cut from the same cloth as a person who worked their way up the ranks through 20 years and eventually got promoted to a CEO or took a CEO role at another company and then worked as a CEO for that time because I was a relatively fresh PhD grad when I first became a CEO, which means I didn't come by it the way that most people come by it through very, very hard work and through earning it. I came through it by virtue of I started my own company. I can call myself whatever I want. So there are ways in which I've been growing into that role, even in recent years, where other people would be far more experienced and seasoned. I think it has advantages too, though, because I think that I am much more in tune with what a young staff around me wants and needs. I think that I've spent so much more time recently working with the entire team that I have a much better perspective on that, a much better understanding of how the entire organization works. So it has its pluses and minuses, but I at times do feel lacking in terms of my knowledge because I just am who I am, like we all are.
Yeah, and it's so interesting you brought that up because I ironically had a similar thought a few weeks ago where I've owned a marketing agency for the past 8 years, but I thought about it. I'm like, if I were to join another company as a CMO, a chief marketing officer, like, would I be at the same level as someone else? Probably not. But it's just so interesting to hear how you kind of share that as well. And you did mention how you've kind of taken some time recently to grow into that. And so, if you're comfortable, I'd love to hear just some of those things that you've noticed or ways that you've kind of helped to grow throughout that time.
That's interesting. And your story is an interesting one because I have a couple of colleagues who are in very similar situations. I got a couple of colleagues who are really sharp people when it comes to marketing, and they've done exactly that same thing that you've decided between having their own sort of private practice, if you will,
Hmm.
versus taking on an in-house role. It's not very different from a lawyer who could choose to have a practice or be
Right.
in-house at a company. And I think those two situations and my situation do bear a lot of similarities. I think for me, the biggest learning point was what exists in a corporate environment that has certain rigidity, certain requirements, certain regulations and things that you just have to do, whether they are legal requirements or whether they're just what is expected in a corporate environment, versus what is it when you're your own boss and you
Yeah.
call all the shots. And there's so many things that are obvious. Like you think about your own personal marketing company, you get to choose whether you want to work with a client or not, right? You
Hmm.
don't like somebody, you just don't return their calls. Or you don't bid on a job, or you don't try to get the next job or whatever. You don't have that luxury at a big company
Mm-mm.
necessarily, especially if they are a really important customer to your parent company, for example. Or you need to hit certain revenue numbers and you can't simply turn down business that is an important part of those goals. So there's obvious things like that where you just really need to adjust your thinking. For me, there was stuff like how the finances are dealt with, how budgeting is done, how forecasting is done, how all the finances are run. When I was my own company, it didn't really matter. We had enough money in
Yeah.
the bank to do things. I just made my own choices. And also, again, it was an LLC, which means basically in Massachusetts, it gets reported on your personal Schedule C if
Hmm.
you're the owner, right? And you're nodding your head like maybe you do that as well. And so there isn't really anything with finance, just in terms, all you need to know is like, how much money did that business cost to run? How much money did that business make? Did you have a profit? Did you have a loss? Are you paying taxes or whatever? That's all you really need to know. And at big companies, it's a totally different story, and the expectations are completely different in terms of what you need to do to make sure that the company runs in a healthy way and that you're following good accounting practices, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot to think about. And of course, on top of all of that, there's politics, there's being a boss and having people who report to you, and lots of other things.
Yeah, those are all great points that you brought up. And I think it's helpful for any of our listeners who may be at the point where they get acquired and kind of become the CEO of the company they founded to kind of listen to and learn from. And so that's one question that I have for you, Andy, is like if someone's listening to this episode and they've been approached by a company that wants to acquire them, like what advice would you have for them for just being acquired, just from what you've learned throughout that process?
I think so. I've had the benefit not only of going through it with Edge, but I've had lots of customers who have been acquired along the way, and so I've been involved in ancillary ways, right? Where like an acquiring company wants to talk to one of the key manufacturers and learn more about the relationship and learn more about the technology at the company that they're thinking about acquiring. So I've been able to see a lot of it from afar. I think I think the important things are to understand what you do and you do not control after the fact, and to understand that there are conversations and then there's contracts. So I think that I think that what I would advise is based on how important it is to the individual, what their role is after the fact. They need to make sure that that's communicated and discussed and codified in contract, because they don't have control, right? Once you
Hmm.
give up ownership of your company, you don't have control anymore. And it doesn't matter if the acquirer is well-intentioned or not, it doesn't matter if they're nice or not. They also don't necessarily just have carte blanche to do whatever you want, or whatever it's going to take to make you happy. So I tend to look at it as a before and an after. So you look at the before and you say, the deal that I'm being offered, that my startup is being offered for acquisition, is this a good deal? Which means, is it a good deal for you personally? Is it a good deal for other shareholders or investors or your employees or whatever? And the kinds of things that might matter to you are, am I getting a fair price for the business? Are
Hmm.
my employees assured of continued employment? Is there an agreement in place that they're going to be taken on? Are my customers going to be taken care of? Are my customers simply going to be told, sorry, we acquired this business, we're not working with you anymore? There's things that will matter to you as the founder, and it might be some of the things I mentioned, or it might be other additional things. You have to make sure that that is satisfied. And then there's the after picture of what happens after to you. Do you have a job? Are you going to be there for an extended period of time? Are you going to be there permanently, or are you going to be let go immediately because you're superfluous?
Yeah.
Any of those things could be fine. It depends on what you, the individual, want, and you just have to make sure that what might happen is okay with you. Because if it's
Hmm.
not written down, it's probably
Yeah.
not going to happen.
Yeah, anything goes at that point. And I think that's all great things to keep in mind in it. And it makes me wonder too, it probably was a bittersweet moment for you in a way where like you had built this company and now you kind of transition into a new role. And so I also wonder too, not only like the physical, I guess, parts that come with navigating an acquisition, but also maybe like the mental or emotional changes that might come from it as well.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'm lucky that at no point has any change that we've undergone been bittersweet at all.
Mm.
Because we've always been in any big changes that my company has undergone has always been where a new entity is coming in and bringing some significant value that we've never had before. So when Anzu came in and invested and they orchestrated this the spin out of Edge, they were bringing all kinds of resources that we didn't have before, technical experts, people really knowledgeable in the biotech space, people who specialized in HR and specialized in patent law and specialized in finance. And we got access to all kinds of amazing people. And they treated us incredibly well. And we reaped huge benefits from being under their control. We probably reaped about all that we could. And in fact, then it made sense for them to say, like, hey, there's lots of interest in people buying plastics companies. Let's go out and see what the market is. Because we were getting our tires kicked by several people.
Hmm.
When Xeon acquired us, totally different scenario, but also an amazing lift for our company. We we manufacture plastic parts. Xeon manufactures plastic. So they understand how the resin works from a basic chemical standpoint in ways that we never understood. The day after we were acquired, we got to ask all kinds of questions about how is this made? What happens when you plasma treat it? What happens when you do this? Do you advise we use this process or that process? Do you have a grade of plastic? And suddenly all these questions are answered by the people who invented it because they're all
Hmm.
still working there. And so for me, it's been like going from the bunny slope to a moderate slope to like a I'm not even a skier, so I'm already out of my element with this analogy. What is it, like a double diamond or something? Is like I
Double
don't even
black
know.
diamond. There you go.
Right. So like to me, that's been what we've been doing in terms of the level of resources that we've had in terms of the strength of the people around us. And so it's just been increased excitement and increased fun and increased ability. And so I've never had a feeling of bittersweetness, fortunately.
That's a best case scenario then, honestly, just to hear that, like you said, they've only continued to add value as you've gone through these different changes. And so knowing that Edge is in its 20th year, I'm curious to hear what do you think is next for the next 20 years, or even I'd say to be more in the short term, like next year. I'm curious to hear any exciting things that might be in development.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we are, of course, in a time when nobody knows what's happening, right?
Hmm.
I feel like in general, with worldwide economies, but also in America, anyone's ability to sort of look in the future has gotten shorter and shorter and shorter. We are at the time of this recording at the beginning of a new presidential administration. Lots of things are happening that nobody really understands. What are the ramifications going to be? There's lots of uncertainty. And I say that doesn't matter to me who anybody voted for, who anybody supports. There's just a lot of things that we don't know.
Right.
And so in the world of biotech, there's a lot of uncertainty right now. This Q1 of 2025 has shattered all kinds of records in a bad way in terms of downswing for revenue and downswing for predictability and downswing for development among strong American biotech companies because of that uncertainty.
Hmm.
So I don't really know what the future holds for Edge because there may be great opportunities there. There may not be great opportunities there. Fortunately, we're able to pivot into some other markets like optics and filtration and other areas where we still offer a lot of value to the customers and where there's a little bit more stability because it's a little bit regulatory lighter industries. Um, I don't know. The truth is that the world landscape has been changing rapidly, especially since COVID, around diagnostics and around plastics so much. It's been hard to predict. So
Yeah.
that's the best answer I can give you, which is I really don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, it is a great reminder in what you've shared that you kind of have to know what you can't control and be able to, like you said, find ways to adapt or look into new markets and think about how you can ultimately roll with the punches with what you've been given.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, just an example along those lines. We were recently talking to one of these big, well-known American biotech companies about a project, and they lost their funding because of situations with the current government funding situation. And so at the last second, the big project that we had spent months talking about and we were about to kick off just evaporated. And that's just the way things go.
Hmm.
But the fellow who's a VP there, who's a colleague of mine for several years, he and I are getting together in a couple days' time, sit down and say, what do we do in this environment? Because he wants to develop products, we want to provide services, but the finance isn't there because of the factors that we're all dealing with. What do we do, right? How
Hmm.
do we move forward together in this environment where we all still want to get things done, but the financial landscape is different? And that's what has to happen across the board anytime there's a major change in how markets work, how the economy works, how the government is dealing with it. And again, I say that not supporting any particular party or from any particular point of view because it's true regardless of what direction the change is in. It takes innovative people to sit down and say, what do I need and what do you need and how do we find a way to work together to make that happen? So there's a
Yeah.
lot of that has to go on all the time, but especially right now.
Yes. And it's exciting to hear that that conversation will be happening shortly. And I'll be curious to see what comes out of it, what new developments or new ideas might come to fruition because of that conversation with the VP.
Me too.
For anyone listening to this episode who's interested in getting into the biospace, who might have not had any prior experience in it, what advice would you have to give to them for just getting started in this industry?
There's a lot of different ways to do it, and it depends on what a given person's interest is. Obviously, if someone's in school, you obviously can take classes, you can major in something relevant, and you can really try to move that way. A lot of people who are in biology and biotech, that's what happened. They took a high school class in biochemistry or something like that that got them really excited, and then they went to college and said, "Hey, this is fun," and they just stayed in that direction. But at Edge, we have people who didn't do that in college, who maybe have college degrees that aren't related to biology at all. We have at least one person who has like an English major, for example. Um, but for example, we have people who went and worked as techs during the COVID, the peak of COVID, when lots of testing was going on. All these centralized labs hired lots and lots of technicians to come in and deal with all of the tests that were coming in to them. There are,
Mhm.
of course, the rapid tests that unfortunately we've all taken at home, but then there are PCR tests that have to go into a lab and be run by a lab tech. So there are people who did that job. That job, of course, has since decreased in demand because the number of tests like that are being run is thankfully much lower now than it was, let's say, 4 years ago. So those people are looking for jobs. So we hired some of them. So those are people who got into biology through a totally sideways mechanism, but are now people who have become really skilled at handling lab equipment and running lab processes. And for us, they are incredible hands-on people who are really good at doing manufacturing, really good at following protocols, developing new protocols. And so, that's just another example. You know, I would say whether it's biology or whether it's something else, choose something that you find really interesting and you're passionate about,
Mhm.
and just keep feeding that because you will never go wrong if you keep loving what you do.
Yes, I love that. And one of my favorite questions to ask our guests is what their favorite local businesses are to support. So I'm curious to hear what your places are to shop at, frequent, support, all the good things.
So two things, but the one that really comes to mind first are hardware stores. They are becoming harder and harder to keep open.
Mhm.
And I know that the big box stores offer a huge selection and amazing prices, but there's something to be said for a local hardware store, which is probably closer to you than the big box store is, and might be a little bit more expensive, but you're going to get personal treatment there.
Mhm.
And I really try to support them whenever I can. The other is restaurants. I think restaurants of all types of cuisine are an important part of American culture, and especially bringing in all the cultures that everyone brings from wherever they might happen to be from, or wherever their parents or grandparents were from. I think cooking at home is great, but if you're not going to cook at home, go to a local restaurant. That's just, where the people who own it work there and they're cooking their cuisine from where they're from. Enjoy it, tip well, and return often. That's my
Yes.
suggestions.
Yes, I love that. And leave a review online, a positive review.
Absolutely.
Andy, this has been a really interesting episode, and I've appreciated having you come on the show. And now I'd love to have you share with our listeners where they can find you online in case they'd like to connect further.
Yeah, the best place is to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I see all my DMs. So if anybody has a question about anything I might be able to help with, just look me up there by my name. I think I'm Andrew, not Andy on there, but there are not a lot of Kamholzes. So you're probably either going to find me or my brother. Um, so drop me a message there. That's the best thing to do. And if anyone has any interest in Edge, there's information on our website for how to submit a message that way.
Perfect. And I will link to both of those places in the show notes to make it easy for our listeners. But thank you so much again for coming on today's show.
Thank you, Ashley. It was a wonderful conversation. I appreciate it.